He couldn't hide his smile. The verdict felt close enough to taste. Then the judge stopped the proceedings and announced new evidence. No one moved, because everyone knew whatever was in that file would change everything. My name is Adrian Vance. For 12 brutal months, I fought to protect what I built. My reputation, my legacy, my freedom. My wife, Celeste, sat across the courtroom, not as my ally, but as my accuser. Her eyes cold, her claims brutal. She painted me a monster, a fraud, an embezzler, a man who'd hidden millions during our marriage. Today, my defense had dismantled her case. My forensic accountant had exposed her financial inconsistencies. Her key witness had cracked under cross-examination. I could see the collapse in her lawyer's posture. Victory wasn't just likely, it was imminent. The champagne was chilling at my penthouse. My partners were ready to toast my vindication. As the judge prepared to dismiss the final spurious charges, I allowed myself one triumphant glance at Celeste. It was over. Then a court clerk burst through the rear doors, a single sealed brown envelope in hand. A whispered conference with the bailiff, a stunned look from my attorney. The gavel cracked. Counsel approach. Moments later, the judge's voice, grave and final. The court admits late Exhibit 47 into evidence. That envelope held my ruin. And Celeste, for the first time in a year, smiled back. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button and comment where you're watching from. He couldn't hide his smile. The verdict felt close enough to taste. Then the judge stopped the proceedings and announced new evidence. No one moved. Because everyone knew whatever was in that file would change everything. The air in courtroom 7B, thick with the scent of old wood and nervous sweat, seemed to crystallize around Adrian Vance. For a fleeting, glorious second, the world had narrowed to the sound of his own lawyer's voice, a steady, persuasive baritone that felt like a lifeline. Miranda Thorne was finishing her closing argument, her words sculpting the air into a narrative of vindication. Adrian's eyes were fixed on the judge, the Honorable Geraldine Miller, whose lined face was an inscrutable mask. But he thought, he was certain, he saw the faintest nod of understanding. A slight softening around her eyes as Miranda dismantled the last of the prosecution's house of cards. His wife's house of cards. Celeste sat at the opposing counsel's table, a study in poised erosion. The elegant charcoal suit she wore, one he'd bought for her at a boutique in Milan a lifetime ago, now seemed like a uniform of war. For 12 months, her image had been his constant antagonist, her face on legal documents, her voice on recorded depositions, her accusations a chilling chorus in his mind: fraud, concealment, perjury. She sought not just a divorce, but his financial evisceration and professional ruin, alleging he'd hidden tens of millions in a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts to cheat her out of a fair settlement. But now, under the relentless glare of Miranda's logic, Celeste's facade was cracking. The rigid line of her shoulders had dipped. Her hands, usually clasped with calm defiance, were now folded in her lap, the knuckles white. Adrian allowed himself a breath, a real one, for what felt like the first time in a year. The champagne was already chilling, a 2008 Dom Perignon waiting in the sub-zero of his penthouse. His brother Mark was in the gallery, ready with a firm handshake that would say, "I knew you'd beat this." His partners at Aurora Venture Capital, though publicly distant, had sent discreet texts of support. This wasn't just about money, it was about the narrative. Winning meant the story would be vindicated Titan beats gold-digging ex. Losing meant disgraced financier commits matrimonial fraud. Miranda's final point was a masterpiece. She held up a simplified chart, a timeline of the so-called hidden transfers to the Cayman entity, Aurora Holdings. "The plaintiff," Miranda said, her voice dripping with restrained contempt, "would have you believe this was a secret conduit for stolen marital assets. But as Dr. Evans testified, this is standard practice in venture capital to isolate liability for a specific high-risk, high-reward investment, the Singapore drone logistics startup SwiftWing. An investment, I remind you, that failed. My client wasn't hiding wealth. He was following protocol to shield the marital estate from a total loss. This isn't fraud, Your Honor. This is prudence being maliciously misconstrued." She paused, letting the silence weigh on the judge. The plaintiff's entire case rests on a foundation of financial illiteracy and vindictive speculation. She sees complex financial structures and imagines conspiracy. She hears legitimate business terms and imagines theft. We have shown you the legitimate ledgers, the independent audit, the testimony of a respected forensic accountant who found zero evidence of concealed assets. What we have here is not a crime, but a tragedy. A marriage's end weaponized into a baseless legal siege. Miranda sat down, the quiet finality of her movement as powerful as any shout. Adrian's own forensic accountant, a meticulous man named Ben, gave him a tiny, confident nod from the row behind the bar. It was over. He could feel it in the shifted energy of the room. The reporters in the back had stopped their frantic scribbling. Celeste's lawyer, a man named Robert Gage, who had all the charisma of a dusty ledger, was shuffling his notes, looking defeated. Judge Miller adjusted her glasses, peering down at her bench notes. This was the moment, the culmination of a year of hellish pressure, of sleepless nights reviewing documents, of the sickening fear that had lived in his gut like a cold stone. He had won. He had protected his world. A surge of pure, unadulterated relief, hot and effervescent, flooded his veins. He turned his head just a few degrees towards the public gallery. His eyes found Mark's. His brother, his rock through this ordeal, was already looking at him, a grin threatening to break across his worried face. Adrian didn't speak. He simply offered the smallest, most private of smiles, a mere curl at the corner of his mouth, a crinkling at the eyes. It wasn't arrogance, he told himself. It was the simple human expression of a burden being lifted. We did it. He allowed his gaze to sweep past Mark and, for one final victorious second, locked onto Celeste. He wanted her to see it, to see the man she'd tried to break, unbroken, to understand the cost of her war. Her head was bowed, staring at her hands. She looked for the first time small, beaten. Then the door at the back of the courtroom, the one that led to the judge's private corridors, slammed open with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot. Every head jerked towards the sound. A young, flushed court clerk, her hair escaping its bun, hurried down the center aisle, clutching a single sealed manila envelope against her chest, as if it were a live grenade. The mundane rustle of her polyester blouse was the only sound in the stunned silence. She bypassed the gallery entirely, moving straight to the bailiff, who leaned down to listen to her frantic whispered words. His eyebrows shot up. He took the envelope, his movement suddenly grave, and approached the bench. Judge Miller held up a hand, stopping the quiet murmur that had begun to rise. "One moment, please." Her voice was calm, but a new wariness had entered it. Adrian's heart, which had been soaring, stuttered and dropped. He looked at Miranda, whose previously triumphant expression had frozen into professional alertness. She was watching the bench, her mind visibly racing. At the other table, Robert Gage had gone very still, but Adrian saw it, a flicker in the man's eyes. Not surprise, anticipation. The bailiff handed the envelope to Judge Miller. She examined the seal, the labeling on the front. She read a notepaper clipped to it. Her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. The silence stretched, becoming viscous, unbearable. Adrian could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead, could feel the pulse pounding in his own temples. "Counsel," Judge Miller finally said, her voice cutting through the thick air. "Approach the bench, now!" Miranda was on her feet in an instant, her chair scraping loudly. Gage was slower, more deliberate, as he rose and buttoned his suit jacket. The two attorneys moved to stand before the judge, who leaned forward, speaking to them in a low, urgent tone the microphones would not catch. Adrian watched, his earlier warmth leaching away, replaced by a creeping, icy dread. He tried to read Miranda's profile. Her back was to him, ramrod straight, but he saw her give a sharp, negative shake of her head. Then she spread her hands in a gesture of vehement protest. Gage merely nodded once, then gestured towards the envelope. The conference felt like it lasted an hour. It was probably 2 minutes. Finally, Miranda turned and walked back to the table. Her face was a professional mask, but Adrian, who had spent a small fortune on her services and had seen her in every mode, recognized the storm behind her eyes. It was fury, and beneath it, a sliver of something worse, alarm. "What is it?" Adrian whispered, the words barely leaving his dry throat. "Not now," she muttered, her eyes fixed on the judge as Gage returned to his seat, a faint, unreadable trace of a smile on his lips. Judge Miller straightened, her gaze sweeping the courtroom. "There has been a development," she announced, her tone leaving no room for interruption. "A third-party data custodian, compelled by a separate, recently executed subpoena, has delivered what has been marked as Exhibit 47. Mr. Gage has moved for its immediate admission into evidence." Miranda was on her feet again. "Your Honor, object. This is a blatant violation of procedural deadlines and discovery rules. The plaintiff had months to submit evidence. We are at the literal closing of the case. To spring new evidence now is prejudicial in the extreme and denies my client his right to a fair defense." "The subpoena was served only last week, Your Honor," Gage replied, his voice calm and oily. "The custodian, a Mr. Miles Braxton, required time to perform a forensic data recovery. The evidence only became available this morning. Given its potentially material nature to the core allegations of fraud and concealment, we felt obligated to present it the moment it was in our possession." Miles Braxton. The name hit Adrian like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. Miles, his old friend, his IT guru for nearly a decade, the man who'd built his secure home network, set up his encrypted cloud backups, who'd laughed with him over single malts in the home study, the man Adrian had fired 8 months ago in a fit of cost-cutting arrogance, dismissing his concerns about antiquated legacy systems with a curt severance check. A data custodian. Forensic recovery. Oh, God. "Your Honor, this is outrageous." Miranda's voice was sharp. "Mr. Braxton is a known disgruntled former associate of my client. This is a setup, not due process." Judge Miller held up the envelope. "The cover sheet indicates the data was recovered from a decommissioned server under a legally binding subpoena, Counselor. The chain of custody appears intact. My concern is the content." She looked from Miranda to Gage, her judicial demeanor warring with clear discomfort. "The allegations at the heart of this case are severe. If this evidence speaks directly to them, excluding it could be a greater miscarriage of justice than admitting it late." She took a deep breath. The gavel was in her hand. "The objection is overruled. Exhibit 47 is admitted into evidence. Given the hour and the need for defense counsel to review this new material, court is adjourned for 1 hour. We will reconvene at 2:15 p.m. Crack. The gavel sounded like the world splitting in two. For a moment, absolute silence held. Then the courtroom erupted in a chaotic buzz. Reporters scrambled for the doors. Mark was on his feet, his face a mask of confusion and fear. Adrian didn't move. He couldn't. His body had turned to stone. His eyes, wide and unblinking, were locked on the manila envelope now resting on the judge's bench. It was just a piece of paper and a fastener, but it seemed to glow with malevolent energy. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, he turned his head towards Celeste's table. She was standing now, gathering her things. Robert Gage was speaking to her in a low voice, a hand on her elbow. And then she did something she hadn't done in all the months of hearings, depositions, and vicious accusations. She looked directly at Adrian. and she smiled. It wasn't a smile of joy or warmth. It was a cold, precise, and utterly terrifying thing. A smile of perfect patient knowledge, a smile that said the last 12 months of his defense, his expert testimonies, his relieved grin to his brother, all of it had been a performance she had allowed, waiting for this exact moment to pull the final curtain. The champagne in his penthouse wasn't just chilling. It was freezing into a solid, useless block of ice. The victory he had tasted had been a phantom flavor, and now his mouth was filled with the ashy certainty of ruin. The envelope held his past, meticulously recorded. And as he stared into his wife's victorious eyes, Adrian Vance knew, with a soul-deep certainty, that it held the end of his future. The walk from the courtroom to the stark, windowless conference room reserved for his defense team was a march through a nightmare. The polished marble of the courthouse corridor, which had earlier felt solid and imposing, now seemed to tilt and swim beneath Adrian's feet. The murmurs of departing spectators, the clacking of a reporter's heels, the distant echo of a slammed door, all of it was muffled, as if he were hearing the world from deep underwater. Miranda was a step ahead, her posture rigid with a fury she was barely containing. Ben, the forensic accountant, trailed behind, his face pale. Miranda slammed the conference room door shut, the sound a gunshot in the small space. She threw her leather portfolio onto the scuffed wooden table and rounded on Adrian. "Start talking, Adrian, right now. Who is Miles Braxton? And what the hell is on that server?" Adrian slumped into a chair, the weight of his body suddenly unbearable. "He was my IT guy, for years. He handled everything. Personal, some business. I fired him last year." "Why?" Miranda's voice was a scalpel. "Cost-cutting. He was getting expensive, paranoid, always wanting to upgrade systems, talking about legacy vulnerabilities. I thought he was just trying to create work." The words sounded pathetic even to him. "Did he have access to encrypted files? Backups? Things you'd deleted?" Ben asked, his voice quiet but urgent. Adrian closed his eyes, a wave of nausea washing over him. "Yes. There was a secure vault, a cloud system, for sensitive things. I told him to wipe it, before the divorce filing. I thought he had." "You thought?" Miranda hissed. "You engaged in a systematic legal defense based on what you thought? I asked you, Adrian, under the sacred attorney-client privilege, which is the only thing that might still be protecting you, I asked you for the absolute, unvarnished truth. Was there anything anywhere that could come back to haunt you? You looked me in the eye and said, no. I believed it," Adrian protested, the heat of shame flooding his face. "It was a backup of old files, drafts, musings, personal financial projections, nothing evidential. In a court of law, Adrian, drafts and musings about hiding assets are evidence. They show intent," Ben said, his tone clinical, which made it worse. He was already mentally disassociating from the sinking ship. A junior associate knocked and entered, carrying a thin stack of printed papers, their copy of Exhibit 47. The air left the room. Miranda snatched the stack and laid it on the table. The first page was a cover sheet from a digital forensics firm called Veritas Recovery, detailing the data pulled from a decommissioned private server owned by Miles Braxton, pursuant to subpoena, Watio 4792. The client data identifier was a string of numbers Adrian recognized as the old encryption key for his Aurora vault. "Go to the data log," Ben said softly. Miranda flipped past the cover sheet. What followed was not a smoking gun. It was an arsenal. Page 1, Authentication Logs. A detailed history showing access to the Vance Aurora Vault from 2 devices, Adrian's primary laptop and a desktop computer with an IP address traced to Miles Braxton's home office. The logs showed Adrian had accessed it frequently in the 24 months before the divorce filing. The last access from his machine was a deletion command, issued 9 days before Celeste filed. The logs then showed a remote backup retrieval by Braxton's machine 3 days after the deletion command. A footnote from the forensic analyst. Subject attempted a secure deletion, but a legacy mirrored backup on the custodian's independent hardware was not purged, likely due to an oversight in the backup protocol configuration. Adrian stared. An oversight. A tiny technical flaw Miles had probably warned him about, an argument he'd dismissed as techno-babble. That flaw was now a noose. Page 2, Financial Transfers, the annotated truth. This was the chart. The same chart of transfers to the Cayman Islands entity that Miranda had so elegantly explained away an hour ago. But this version was different. It was from the vault, marked True Ledger for eyes only. Next to each transfer, in a clean digital font generated by a voice-to-text app he used while driving, were his own annotations. Next to a 2-mailer wire, route through Aurora, Cayman. Celeste only sees the loss on the main Kestrel books. This stays separate. Returns go to Singapore side pocket. Next to a $750K transfer, divert quarterly fund distribution. Label as operating expense for Kestrel. She tracks the dividend income too closely. And the most damning, next to a series of smaller recurring transfers. Establish liquidity stream in Cayman, untouchable for marital assessment. Think of it as an insurance policy. Ben made a small, choked sound. They have the map and the legend. Page 3. The Kestrel valuation. This was an email chain, printed in full. It was between Adrian and David Forrester, the jovial, respected independent appraiser who had testified just 3 days ago, swearing under oath that his depressed valuation of Adrian's flagship investment, Kestrel Dynamics, was fair, independent, and based solely on market conditions. The chain told a different story. Adrian, 18 months ago. Dave, need a favor. For the marital balance sheet, we need to take a conservative view on Kestrel. The tech is ahead of its time. Market's jittery. Can we value it at the Series A level? Forrester. Adrian? That's a 60% haircut from its last funding round. That's not conservative, that's surgical. It raises flags. Adrian. It's a messy divorce, Dave. I can't have her walking away with half of a paper fortune that might evaporate. It's for stability, for my son's future. Help me out. Forrester. I don't like this. It's walking a fine line. For our friendship, I'll do the valuation, but I want no paper trail. We talk on the phone, you get the number. My official report will cite market volatility. Adrian, you're a lifesaver. Drinks on me soon. Miranda let the page fall from her fingers. It fluttered to the table like a dying bird. Perjury, she whispered. We suborned perjury. He testified. We entered his report into evidence. She looked at Adrian, her eyes devoid of any professional warmth, only a horror-stricken clarity. He'll flip. He'll get a deal to testify that you coerced him. And this, she stabbed a finger at the annotated transfers, this isn't just hiding assets, this is a blueprint for fraud. It shows specific intent to deceive the court and your spouse. The room began to spin. Adrian gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles bone white. The cold stone of dread in his gut had metastasized, spreading a paralyzing chill through his limbs. He saw it now, not as a shocked husband, but as the financier he was, a strategist seeing a rival's masterstroke. Celeste's case had been weak, purposefully so. The inconsistencies, the reliance on his legitimate but complex structures, Gage's subdued performance. It was all bait. They had let him build his entire defense on a foundation of lies and half-truths. They let him call his expert to explain away the transfers. They let Forrester commit perjury. They waited until the entire edifice was complete, until he was moments from a verdict that would have sealed his victory. And then they introduced the demolition charges. It wasn't just about winning. It was about total annihilation. She knew, Adrian rasped, the realization of physical pain. She knew about the vault. She must have. Miles. After I fired him, he went to her. Of course he did, Miranda exploded, finally losing her composure. You fired a man with the keys to your kingdom. What did you think would happen? He's the third-party data custodian. She and Gage have been sitting on this, waiting for the perfect moment to maximize the damage. They've made you and me and Ben and Forrester look like a cabal of liars. The judge is furious. She feels manipulated by the defense. The door opened again. The same junior associate looking even more anxious. Ms. Thorne, the judge's clerk. The plaintiff has moved for an immediate directed verdict in their favor on all financial counts. And they've made a formal request for the judge to refer the matter to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation into perjury, fraud, and false swearing. The finality of it crashed down. A directed verdict meant the judge decided. No jury, no further deliberation. Based on Exhibit 47, she would rule against him, and a criminal referral. We need to settle, now, Ben said, his voice hollow. We give her everything she originally asked for, plus more. Try to stave off the criminal side. It's too late for that, Miranda said, her shoulders slumping. She doesn't want a settlement. She wants a judgment. She wants a court order stating you committed fraud. She wants the DA to press charges. This is about legacy, Adrian. She's writing the history book, and in it, you are the villain. The bailiff's knock was a death knell. Court reconvenes in 5 minutes, counsel. The walk back was a funeral procession. The earlier buzz in the corridor had solidified into a quiet, watchful tension. News traveled fast. As Adrian entered the courtroom, every eye was on him, but he no longer saw individuals, only a blur of hungry, pitying, or satisfied faces. He couldn't bring himself to look at the gallery. He couldn't face Mark. He took his seat, the wood feeling like ice. Celeste was already at her table, posture perfect, her earlier defeat replaced by an unnerving serenity. Robert Gage stood, adjusting his cufflinks, a man about to give a well-rehearsed performance. Judge Miller entered. The room rose and sat in a hushed rustle. Her face was stern, carved from granite. She did not look at Adrian. Mr. Gage, she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. You may proceed. Gage moved to the lectern with the quiet confidence of a surgeon picking up a scalpel. Thank you, Your Honor. Given the late hour and the conclusive nature of the newly admitted evidence, I will be brief. He activated the screen. A copy of the annotated transfer ledger appeared, blown up for all to see. What you see here, Gage began, his tone conversational, almost gentle, is not a misunderstanding. It is not financial complexity beyond the plaintiff's grasp. It is a confession. He pointed to the line about the insurance policy. This is the defendant's own voice, describing his intent to create an untouchable pool of marital assets. This directly contradicts the testimony of his expert, Dr. Evans, and his own sworn deposition. Click. The email chain with Forrester appeared. This is not a legitimate business valuation. This is a conspiracy to lowball an asset's worth by 60%, specifically to defraud a spouse. Mr. Forrester's sworn testimony 3 days ago is now incontrovertible perjury, undertaken at the defendant's behest. Gage turned to face the judge, spreading his hands. The defendant, Your Honor, built his defense on a lie. He exploited the court's processes, presented perjured testimony, and offered expert analysis meant to obscure the clear truth, now in evidence. His conduct is not only a breach of his marital duties, but a fundamental assault on the integrity of this court. We move for a directed verdict on all financial claims in the plaintiff's favor. Furthermore, given the evidence of criminal conduct, fraud, falsifying business records, subornation of perjury, we respectfully request this court refer this matter to the criminal authorities. Every word was a precise, measured hammer blow. Adrian felt himself shrinking in his chair, his once proud posture collapsed inward. He stared at the grain of the table wood, wishing he could vanish into it. Judge Miller was silent for a long moment. She looked at Miranda. "Miss Thorne, do you have anything to add?" Miranda stood. She looked exhausted, defeated. "Your Honor, we have only just received this evidence. We request time to—" "To do what, Counselor?" Judge Miller interrupted, not unkindly but with finality. "The evidence is authenticated. It speaks for itself. The motion for a directed verdict is granted. Judgment on the financial claims is entered for the plaintiff, per the terms of her initial filing. With prejudicial interest," she turned her gaze directly to Adrian. It was not angry, but profoundly disappointed. "Mr. Vance, this court has been misled. That cannot stand. I am signing the referral to the district attorney's office as we speak." She brought the gavel down. Crack. It was over. Numb, Adrian slowly raised his head. The courtroom was in motion, people standing, talking, but he heard nothing. His blurred vision swept across the gallery, a sea of indistinct shapes, and then it focused. There, in the very last row, half hidden by the doorway, stood his son, Leo, 16 years old. He must have skipped school. His face, so like Celeste's in its fine features, was pale and utterly still. His eyes, wide and shockingly blue, were locked on Adrian's. In them, Adrian did not see anger. He saw the thing he feared most, the shattering of a foundational truth. He saw the moment a son's image of his father, the successful, the strong, the provider, dissolved into dust, replaced by the stark, court-certified portrait of a liar and a fraud. Leo held his gaze for one more second, a lifetime of love and trust ending in that silent verdict. Then he turned and walked out of the courtroom, disappearing into the corridor without a backward glance. That was the moment Adrian Vance truly lost. Not the money, not the reputation, not his freedom. It was the look in his son's eyes. That was the final evidence, and it was inadmissible, irrevocable, and utterly devastating. 3 months later, the air in the small, rented conference room at his new lawyer's office tasted of dust and defeat. It was a far cry from the sleek, panoramic views of Miranda Thorne's firm. This room smelled of cheap carpet cleaner and stale coffee. Adrian Vance sat, his shoulders hunched inside a suit that now seemed a size too large. The man across from him, Eli Rosen, was a criminal defense attorney with a kind face, tired eyes, and a reputation for managing disaster, not preventing it. Spread between them were the plea deal papers from the district attorney's office. They're offering 18 to 36 months, with the possibility of parole after 12. If you plead guilty to the top count of falsifying business records in the first degree, Eli said, his voice a low, steady monotone. The perjury and fraud charges would be dropped. It's a gift, considering. A gift, Adrian repeated, the word ash in his mouth. Considering the evidence, Adrian. Considering the judge's referral, considering that your former appraiser, David Forrester, has already rolled over and is cooperating fully. They have your own voice, your own emails. A trial would be a spectacle, and you would lose, badly. The sentence could be 5 to 15. Adrian stared at the paragraph outlining the admission of guilt. His life had been reduced to this, a choice between one cage and a slightly larger one. The fall had been swift and total. Aurora Venture Capital had forced his resignation to focus on his personal legal matters. The SEC inquiry had frozen his remaining assets. The penthouse was sold, the proceeds sequestered in a court-controlled account pending Celeste's judgment. He lived in a furnished apartment in a building with thin walls and the constant smell of other people's cooking. The silence there was the worst, a profound echoing emptiness where the hum of his former life used to be. But the true punishment, the one that woke him gasping at 3 a.m., was Leo. His son had not answered a single call, a single text. Celeste's lawyer had communicated, through Eli, that Leo was in therapy and that any contact was detrimental to his emotional well-being at this time. Adrian had seen him once, from a distance, leaving his old house with Celeste, getting into her car. He moved with a slouched defiance that was entirely new, a physical manifestation of betrayal. Adrian had stayed in his car, parked half a block away. Invisible, a ghost haunting his own life. "What about Leo?" Adrian asked, his voice raw. Eli sighed, a sound of practiced sympathy. "Family court is separate, but a guilty plea, an acceptance of responsibility, it could be seen as a first step, a necessary one if you ever want to rebuild that bridge. Fighting this, dragging him through a criminal trial where his father is portrayed as a conniving liar, that burns the bridge for good." The word responsibility lodged in Adrian's chest. For a year, his entire mental architecture had been built on a foundation of justified defense. Celeste was vindictive. The system was unfair. He was the real victim. But alone in the sterile silence of his apartment, with only the damning echo of his own voice memos from Exhibit 47 for company, that architecture had crumbled. He had listened to them, forcing himself to hear not the savvy financier, but the husband. The tone wasn't that of a man protecting his family from risk. It was cold, calculating, possessive. "She tracks the dividend income too closely. Untouchable for marital assessment." He had started seeing the therapist, Dr. Vance, a court-mandated requirement. At first he'd performed, offering polished justifications. But the doctor, a quiet woman with a disconcerting ability to sit in silence, had finally asked, "Who were you protecting with those hidden accounts, Adrian? And from what?" The answer, when it finally came, had sickened him. He wasn't protecting his family from financial loss. He was protecting his control from Celeste's scrutiny. He was protecting a version of himself, the infallible provider, from the messy, equal partnership of a marriage. The insurance policy wasn't for their future, it was for his own sovereignty. He had rewritten their shared financial history into a solo venture, and in doing so, had rewritten his wife into an adversary. The final mandated mediation for child support and a theoretical visitation schedule was held in another sterile room in the family court building. Celeste entered alone, her lawyer waiting outside. She wore a simple black dress, no jewelry. She looked older, the strain of the past year etched around her eyes, but there was a terrifying clarity in her gaze. They sat across from each other, a cheap laminate table between them. The mediator droned on about guidelines and calculators. "I don't care about the maximum," Adrian interrupted, his voice quiet. "Whatever the calculation says, pay it. More. If you need." Celeste watched him, her expression unreadable. When the mediator stepped out to fetch a form, the silence expanded. Adrian found he couldn't bear it. "The college fund," he said, the words torn from him. "The Kestrel collateral. You never mentioned it in court." Celeste's gaze didn't waver. "I didn't need to. Miles found the loan documents in the same vault. But that was the moment, Adrian. Not the money, not the hidden accounts. When I found out you'd pledged Leo's future, the one concrete thing we'd built for him, to backstop your secret gamble, and then you lied to my face about it, said the fund was fully secure." She shook her head slowly. "That's when I knew I couldn't believe a word you said. That's when I knew it wasn't about money. It was about a fundamental brokenness. I had to get an objective, third-party record of the truth. Because you had gaslit me for so long, I was starting to question my own sanity." Her words weren't shouted. They were precise, surgical. They cut deeper than any cross-examination. "I didn't want to destroy you," she continued, her voice softening with something that might have been pity. "I wanted the truth to exist somewhere outside of your spin. Every time you stood in that courtroom and celebrated a lie, you proved why Exhibit 47 was necessary. It wasn't a trap, Adrian. It was a lifeline, for me and for Leo, so he could one day see what was real, even if it was ugly." He had no defense. The carefully constructed narrative of the vengeful ex-wife evaporated under the quiet heat of her truth. She hadn't been hunting for treasure, she'd been digging for bedrock. Can I ever see him?" he asked, the question sounding pathetic, stripped of all his former power. Celeste looked at him for a long time. "That's not up to me. It's up to him. And right now, the man he sees is the one from that evidence. The one who schemed and lied. Maybe start by not being that man anymore." The plea hearing was a different kind of courtroom. Smaller, darker, less populated. This was the machinery of the state, grinding efficiently. Mark was there, a solid, grieving presence in the front row. Celeste was not. Leo was not. The judge asked him to rise. "Mr. Vance, to the count of falsifying business records in the first degree, how do you plead?" Adrian's mouth was desert dry. He looked at the judge, then at Eli's encouraging nod. He thought of Miranda's fury, Ben's disillusionment, Forrester's betrayal. He thought of Celeste's exhausted clarity in the mediation room. Most of all, he thought of Leo's shattered eyes in the back of the courtroom. The old Adrian, the one from before the envelope, would have fought. He would have seen a plea as weakness, another battle to be waged on ego alone. That man was gone. He had been dismantled by his own words, preserved in digital amber. He found he didn't miss him. "Guilty, Your Honor." The word hung in the air, not with drama, but with a heavy, final simplicity. The judge asked him a series of procedural questions, which he answered in a low, clear voice. Yes, he understood. Yes, he was doing this voluntarily. Yes, he was guilty. There was no triumphant gavel. Just a date set for sentencing and a slow shuffling of papers. As he turned to leave, his cuffs loose around his wrists, he saw a movement at the back of the courtroom. The door was closing, but in the narrow window of the frosted glass, he saw a flash of a familiar blue jacket. Leo's jacket. His heart seized. The bailiff gestured for him to move. He walked out, his legs unsteady, into the bright, indifferent hallway. He looked frantically both ways. There, by the water fountain, leaning against the wall, was his son. He was taller, it seemed, his adolescent lankiness hardening into a young man's frame. His face was guarded, a fortress. Adrian stopped, a few feet away. The space between them felt like a chasm carved by all his lies. "Leo," he breathed. "Mom said you were pleading," Leo said, not looking at him, studying the linoleum floor. "She said I could come if I wanted." "I don't know why I wanted." "I'm glad you did." "Are you?" Leo's eyes flicked up, blazing with a confused hurt. "Because I heard you. Guilty." So it was all true, all of it. The hidden money, the lying to Mom, about the college thing. All of it. "Yes," Adrian said, the admission scraping his throat raw. "It was all true. I did those things. My reasons, they don't matter. They were wrong. I was wrong." Leo blinked, as if the simple admission was a language he didn't understand. He'd been braced for excuses, for the familiar spin. The unvarnished truth disarmed him. "I'm going to go away for a while," Adrian said, forcing himself to hold his son's gaze. "I deserve to. But I want you to know. Every day I'm gone, I will be working on one thing. Becoming a man who deserves to be your father again. Not the one with the money or the big house, just one you could maybe not hate." Leo's jaw worked. He looked down again, scuffing his shoe against the floor. The anger was still there, a thick, palpable cloud. But beneath it, Adrian saw something else. The faintest crack in the fortress wall. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the possibility of its future existence. Without another word, Leo pushed off the wall and walked away, down the long courthouse corridor. He didn't look back. Adrian watched him go until he turned a corner and disappeared. The emptiness that filled him was different this time. It wasn't the panicked void of loss he'd felt in the immediate aftermath of Exhibit 47. It was a clean, hollowed-out space. Painful, but clear. The rubble of his old life had been carted away. The lot was empty. Eli approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. That was good. That was a start. Adrian nodded, unable to speak. He walked out of the courthouse into the pale afternoon light. There were no reporters now. His story was old news, just another white-collar guy who'd gotten caught. He stood on the steps, the same steps he'd descended a year ago feeling invincible. He had won every argument. He had out-debated, outmaneuvered, outspent. He had celebrated in the arena of his own cleverness. And in doing so, he had lost absolutely everything. The victory had been the crime. The loss was the sentence, and it was longer than any judge could impose. It was the life sentence of living with the man he'd been, and the long, uncertain road of building a man he could bear to be. He turned his back on the courthouse and began the slow walk towards nothing, which was, for the first time, also a walk towards something real.